I'm joined again today by Dr. W. Matthews Grant and Dr. Timothy Pawl, both professors of philosophy at the University of St. Thomas, Minnesota. Each of them has published numerous scholarly articles and other influential writings. Dr. Pawl has written 2 books on Christology, In Defense of Conciliar Christology and In Defense of Extended Conciliar Christology. And Dr. Grant has authored the 2019 book, Free Will and God's Universal Causality, the Dual Sources Account. And we've discussed these books with Dr. Pawl and Dr. Grant on previous episodes of the show. Dr. Grant and Dr. Pawl, welcome back to the Classical Theism Podcast.
Thank you.
Hello, thanks for having us.
So myself and the listeners are always interested in checking in on what our guests are up to. And this is kind of exciting because it's the first time we've had both of you on at the same time. And I know you both work in proximity to each other, but give us a quick update. What have you each been working on, currently and over the past few months? Dr. Pawl, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks again for having us on. And we are in close proximity. I mean, if I punched really hard, you would see my fists come through just above those black books right behind Matthews. So I could wave from there, I suppose. But I've been working on psychology and Christian moral wisdom, in particular Thomistic moral wisdom. And recently, I've been thinking about the following sort of project, which isn't funded yet, but I sure would like to get money to do. And it's to look at what Aquinas says in the second part of the second part about the species of virtues and vices. Like you've got fortitude, and under it, you've got the species of fortitude that have to do with enduring. And under that, you have the species that endure with respect to some situation or with respect to something internal to you. And if it's internal to you, it's either patience, if it's in the present, or it's long suffering, if it's in the future. He's got that for everything, right? It's all architectonically laid out. But I'd like to give a taxonomy of it. And then secondly, after a taxonomy, pardon me, see if some psychologists will work with me to form psychological constructs to employ. And then after doing that, there's lots of wisdom in Christianity about how to grow in particular virtues. It'd be neat to see that wisdom put into psychological lingo, psychological constructs and interventions, and then tested. Does fasting really help you? Does fasting from food really help you spurn the temptations to other delights, like sexual delights, sobriety? Does it, like alcoholic delights? Well, that's an empirical question, and it could be tested. So I'd love to see this taxonomy spelled out, and then tests of the interventions done too.
No, that sounds like a tremendous future project. I hope you can find a venue for it and the funding for it, because it really does sound like a great idea. Dr. Grant, what have you been up to?
Gosh, preparing for classes and administrative work is what I feel like I've been up to. And I guess I kind of have had a couple of things that I wrote recently. They're basically done now. One is a look at the concept of divine transcendence and how that might help with understanding the relationship between divine action and creaturely action. And I think the sort of account that I develop in the book that you mentioned is part of that tradition. And so I have a paper recently that tries to give a more detailed look at that tradition. Some people think that there's a transcendence approach that sort of gives a middle way between a sort of libertarian and a compatibilist view of the relation of human freedom in relationship to God. And I don't think that quite works out. I think it's going to have to be one or the other. But I argue that if you develop that transcendence approach, you get an account that is reconciles with libertarian freedom. So that, and then another thing, just on kind of an overview on Aquinas's account of divine causality, which is a kind of just a helpful one-stop place to go, and talks about how God is, you can understand him as an efficient cause, final cause, exemplary cause, and so on.
No, those both sound fantastic. And is the paper on divine transcendence forthcoming, or is it already out?
These are both forthcoming, but I think they'll be out pretty soon.
All right, fantastic. Okay. Well, thank you for filling us in on all that great work you're doing, but we're going to jump right into the meat here because we've got a lot to cover. We're looking today, the main topic is going to be, the reason we have both of you on is with your recent paper responding to the aloneness argument against classical theism. And so we're going to take a look at your paper. You're going to walk us through some of the key ideas and counterpoints that you've both leveled. And then towards the end, I'm going to raise some objections, some which come up in the paper itself, and then some which kind of take us a little bit beyond into where the discussion may advance even in the future. So it's really great to have both of you here to talk about this. And we'll start with part one, which is the stage setting in our outline. And Dr. Grant, I'm going to direct this to you first. But among what claims of classical theism, because it's the aloneness argument against classical theism, that's the argument that we're addressing here. Among what claims of classical theists does the aloneness argument purport to show an inconsistency? So they're saying it's showing an inconsistency. And then why do you say in your paper that you think this argument, quote unquote, advances the discussion?
Sure, yeah. So there are 4 claims. The aloneness argument attempts to show an inconsistency between 4 claims that have been endorsed by classical theists. So the first claim is the doctrine of divine simplicity and all that involves. But what's particularly important for the argument is divine simplicity's denial that God has any accidents. So that's the first claim. The second claim is the claim that for anything at all with positive ontological status other than God, God is free to create or not create that thing. Okay, so the third claim, which I think really follows from the second, is the claim that it's possible that God exists all by himself without anything distinct from God. And I think that just follows from the idea that in claim 2, that everything with positive ontological status other than God, God is free to create or not create. So it's possible that he not create anything, in which case he's all by himself, he's alone. That's what the authors Schmidt and Mullins call the aloneness of God. And then finally, a fourth claim is the claim that God is omniscient. Okay. I think we could think of the aloneness argument fundamentally as an argument against the doctrine of divine simplicity. It's an argument that divine simplicity is inconsistent with other things classical theists want to hold. In particular, you can think of the argument as trying to show that in the possible scenario where God doesn't create anything and he's thus alone, that a simple God, a God that doesn't have any accidents, would not be able to know the contingent truth that I am alone or God is alone, which would therefore contradict God's omniscience. The aloneness argument belongs to a family of arguments that are sometimes called modal collapse arguments that aim to show that the doctrine of divine simplicity is incompatible with God's contingent action and knowledge. But I think the argument is unique and that it advances the discussion because it focuses on the particular situation where the simple God does not create anything. And this focus is significant because some authors, myself included, have proposed accounts on which a simple God's contingent knowledge consists in relations to objects distinct from God. But that won't work for God's contingent knowledge that he is alone, since in such a world there aren't any objects distinct from God. So the argument is interesting because in the scenario envisioned, there's a contingent truth that God is alone that one might think cannot be accounted for by the extrinsic relational account of God's knowledge that some have used to explain how a simple God could know contingent truths without having any accidents. And so far as it poses that challenge, I think it advances the discussion and it's a pretty interesting argument.
No, that's a good point because they can say, and even if we grant the accounts that you've given for how God can know contingent things, you still have to explain this other aspect. But there's still, we're still setting out a bird's eye view here with the stage setting. So I'm going to let Dr. Pawl talk us a little bit more about what is the quote unquote alone world and the aloneness argument in some more detail. If you can lay it out for us, I can also put up aspects of it for us up on the screen. But what is the aloneness argument in some more detail, Dr. Pawl?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for asking. The aloneness, the alone world is a situation in which God and only God exists. Now we know that situation isn't in fact actual because here we three are and we're existing our hearts out, but it could have been actual. And God could have created nothing at all. And had he not created anything at all, then God would have been, well, there it is in the name, he would have been alone. So that's what the alone world is. The aloneness argument attempts to show that such aloneness is inconsistent with other central theses of classical theism, as Matthews just pointed out for us. And the argument goes as follows, and here you might share it, John, if you could. And I'll quote from Schmidt and Mullins here. So you see it there. Premise 1 tells us that God's knowledge is either wholly intrinsic to God, wholly extrinsic to God, or intrinsic to God in some respects, but extrinsic to God in other respects. Now, as for what intrinsic and extrinsic mean, we'll get into that a fair bit in the future, because depending on how you understand it, it'll mean different things. And he says furthermore, or they say, that is, they say furthermore, that God's knowledge is wholly extrinsic to God, or intrinsic in some respects, but extrinsic in others, only if God doesn't exist alone. That is a necessary condition for some extrinsicality to God's knowledge, is God's not being alone. That's the second premise. But 3, possibly God exists alone. And so from those 3 premises, possibly God's knowledge is wholly intrinsic. That's what the 4th premise tells us. Now, 5th premise says this: necessarily, God contingently has some knowledge. We're going to focus on that premise a fair bit in the future, but I'll say it again. Necessarily, God contingently has some knowledge. So from 4 and 5, possibly God contingently has wholly intrinsic knowledge. Now, whatever is wholly intrinsic to God, or to S, to anything, whatever is wholly intrinsic to S is either an essential feature of S or an accident of S. That's supposed to divide the playing field. You either have essential features or you have accidental features, and that's that. Nothing God contingently has can be an essential feature of God, owing to the fact, I think, that they're assuming here that essential features are features that a thing must have in any situation in which it exists. And so it couldn't be contingent to the thing that it have it. And so from what I've called, or what they've called 6 through 8, possibly God has an accident, this contingent knowledge feature. Nothing God contingently has can be essential feature of God. Oh, I've already said that one, I'm sorry. The chat popped up right in front of what I was reading. Now, if the doctrine of divine simplicity is true, then it's not possible that God has an accident. That's what the 10th premise says. And so, from 9 and 10, the doctrine of divine simplicity is false. To say that last bit again, if it's true, it's not possible that God has an accident, but we've shown that it's possible that God has an accident, so much the worse for the doctrine of divine simplicity. That's how the argument goes.
All right, very good. So let's get into some of your response, because your paper is called "The Aloneness Argument Fails," and you have different kinds of responses to different aspects of it. So I'm going to direct this to Dr. Grant, where your main response concerns how to interpret God's knowledge in the argument, quote unquote, that term, God's knowledge. Can you explain the 2 different ways of taking it, and then which premises will be denied as a result?
Yeah, sure. So this phrase "God's knowledge" and can be ambiguous. In general, phrases such as S is knowledge, where S is any subject, or S is belief, can be ambiguous. So sometimes we use them to refer to a particular mental state. Sometimes we use them to refer to the object or content of a mental state, object or content of knowledge or belief. On other occasions, we use them as a shorthand for certain assertions or predications that we make, in which case S is knowledge is shorthand for the predication or assertion, S knows such and such. Okay, so we can use God's knowledge in any of these different senses. In their paper, Schmidt and Mullins talk about both features and predications. Now, they use feature as a generic term that covers any positive ontological item. So they define the way they're going to use a feature, and they say a feature is just any positive ontological item. And this raises the question of what God's knowledge means, this this talk of both features and predications and the premises of the aloneness argument. So when they refer to God's knowledge as they do in those premises, we can ask, does God's knowledge say God's knowledge that he is alone in the alone world? Does that refer to some feature, to some positive ontological item? Or when they use that phrase, God's knowledge, is that just a shorthand way of mentioning the truth that God knows such and such? For example, of mentioning the truth that God knows that he's alone. The first reading of God's knowledge we could call the feature reading. So if we were going to take references to God's knowledge in the premises of the argument to refer to positive ontological items, that would be the feature reading of the argument. And the second reading we could call the predication reading, where God's knowledge just refers as a kind of shorthand to God knows such and such, like God knows that he's alone. Well, we argued that on either reading, the aloneness argument fails. If we read God's knowledge as referring to a feature, then it turns out that reading undermines premise 5 of the aloneness argument. But on the other hand, if we adopt the predication reading of God's knowledge, that's going to undermine premise 2.
Okay, I think that's a good setup for us with those distinctions of the feature reading of God's knowledge and the predication reading of God's knowledge. And so we'll kind of go on both of those and hear some more of the details. So Dr. Pawl, I'm going to kick it back over to you. Why does God's knowledge interpreted as a feature, so taking that feature reading, why does that vitiate premise 5, as you say in the paper?
Yeah, good. So a necessary condition for an argument to be sound is for it to have all true premises. So an argument whose premises contradict one another can't be a sound argument. And I'll argue here that premise 5, understood in the feature interpretation, contradicts premise 3 of the aloneness argument, which would be a bad-making feature for it. Now recall that premise 5 states, and there you've kindly got it on the screen for us, it states necessarily God contingently has some knowledge. On the feature interpretation, keeping in mind that a feature in their terminology is an item of some positive ontological status, this premise says that in every possible world, that is necessarily, in every possible world, God contingently has some entity with some positive ontological status. Now, in no world does God have God contingently. Like, what would that even mean for God to have God contingently? And so on the feature interpretation, in every possible world, God contingently has some other entity with some positive ontological status. That's the first step of this argument. Good so far?
Yes. And because of that necessary operator, that's why it's no matter what, all possible worlds, he's going to have something else.
Some feature where feature is understood as some entity with positive ontological status. Okay. So we found that on the feature interpretation, in every possible world, something with positive ontological status other than God exists, and God has that thing. Now, if that's true, then it's impossible for God to exist alone. For to exist alone, he has to exist, and nothing that is not God exists. No other thing with positive ontological status is there. Now, if we look back at the argument, and in particular at premise 3, we'll see that it says, possibly, God exists alone. And as we've seen, premise 5, understood in the feature sense, entails the falsity of premise 3. So this argument, on this interpretation of it, is unsound.
All right. I think that's an important response. And I think one that even Schmidt and Dr. Mullins would grant that they did not intend the feature reading. I had seen that from some of their follow-up comments, but that's a great point that if they did intend it, or if someone else intends it, it doesn't work because those two premises do contradict each other. So next, thank you for that, Dr. Pawl. We're going to turn our attention to the predication reading. I'm going to kick it back over to Matthew's Grant here. And he's going to tell us, why is God's knowledge interpreted as a predication vitiate premise 2? And this is going to get into some technical waters, but I think it's important. And actually, let me just say briefly to the listeners, because I actually stared at premise 2 for a while and was very confused. But if you read it right after premise 1, then it'll make more sense. So premise one says God, and Dr. Pawl did this nicely earlier. Premise one is God's knowledge is either wholly intrinsic to God, wholly extrinsic to God, or intrinsic to God in some respects, but extrinsic to God in others. And then premise two says God's knowledge is wholly extrinsic to God or intrinsic to God in some respects, but extrinsic to God in others, only if God doesn't exist alone. So the key aspect, what they're really pinpointing, is that God's knowledge can only have this extrinsic element. That can only be possible only if God's not alone. If he's alone, there's no extrinsic element. That's kind of the thrust of that premise two that I just kind of stared at a little bit befuddled the first time I read it. So, and Dr. Grant, feel free to go into more detail as you explain it. But why does God's knowledge interpreted as a predication? How do you think that that's going to vitiate premise two?
Yeah, so if God's knowledge, again, interpreted as a predication, it's just standing for the predication or the assertion that God knows such and such, whatever that happens to be, including in the alone world, God knows that he's alone. Okay, so we're talking about predications here and what would be required to make these extrinsic predications. Okay, that's what's really at issue. Well, early in their paper, the authors, speaking very generally, say that, quote, extrinsic predications of S, of some subject S, are true, at least in part, in virtue of something outside S to which S relationally stands, end quote. So in other words, for a predication S is P to be an extrinsic predication, S must have a relation to something else outside S or extrinsic to S. Now, given Schmidt and Mullins' rule here for extrinsic predications, we can see why premise two would turn out to be true on a predication reading of God's knowledge. The predication, God knows such and such, for example, God knows that he is alone, that predication could be extrinsic only if God isn't alone. For the predication given this rule could be extrinsic only by God standing in a relation to something outside him. And in the alone world, there isn't anything outside him, okay? So given that rule for predications, extrinsic predications, you can see why God's knowledge on a predication reading could be extrinsic only if God's not alone. Well, we think that the problem is with Schmidt and Mullins' rule for extrinsic predications. We reject it. In its place, we and others would endorse what we call a whether or not account, on which extrinsic predications do not require something outside the subject to which the subject is related. Rather, on this whether or not account, a predication can be extrinsic based on whether or not the subject stands in a relation to something else. On the whether or not rule for extrinsic predications, the predication reading of premise two of the aloneness argument is clearly false. Okay? For God's knowledge, including the predication that God knows that he is alone, could be extrinsic by his not standing in a relation to anything else, in which case it could be extrinsic even if God is alone. That is, even if there isn't anything else for him to be related to. So again, the whether or not account of extrinsic predications, it allows a predication to be extrinsic on the basis of God's not standing in a relation to other things. And so it's an account on which premise two of that argument on the predication reading just turns out to be false.
So I want to go into some of the reasons why you prefer your account over this stronger view. And Dr. Pawl, I'm going to kick it back over to you. Why do you think this whether or not view, as Dr. Grant called it, why do you think this whether or not view of extrinsic predication is more plausible than a stronger view suggested by Schmidt and Mullins? And perhaps you give some examples in the paper. Maybe you can give some examples too.
Sure, yep. I got three things I want to say here. Two are reasons why I like this view better than I like their view of extrinsicality. And a third is what you might do even if they come back and have good reasons why you should accept, or better, they come back and have reasons why my first two reasons aren't good reasons. So three things. First, a reason from authority, from their own authority, in fact, They cite David Lewis as their key authority for what extrinsicality and intrinsicality are. But David Lewis, in On the Plurality of Worlds, on the very page they cite, defines intrinsic and extrinsic properties as follows. He says, quote, "We distinguish intrinsic properties, which things have in virtue of the way they themselves are, from extrinsic properties, which they have in virtue of, here it comes, in virtue of relations or lack of relations to other things." So their own authority has our view of extrinsicality, not their view of extrinsicality. So one reason is just from the authorities in the debates, they don't have the right view of extrinsicality here. Secondly, the ontological commitment or costs required for their view. So I think their view has a much higher ontological burden than our view does. Consider, as an example, claims of unaccompaniment, so claims of not being accompanied by things. That's an extrinsic relation. My not being surrounded by things right now is extrinsic insofar as it is a relation I bear to other things outside of me. That is, being surrounded is. To use an example we use in the paper, I'm unaccompanied by zebras at the present moment. There aren't any in here. I promise you, you'd probably hear them if they were. So this predicate, unaccompanied by zebras, is not intrinsic to me. I could have stayed the very same, yet you could have made the claim false. So from where I sit, not 5 miles away, we have a zoo, and in that zoo, there are zebras. And you could have pulled an Ocean's 11 style heist and gone and pilfered some zebras and got them here. You could do it within the hour. You tried hard. It wouldn't be Ocean's 11, it'd be like Savannah 11 or something, but you could do it. Now, if Schmidt and Mullins are right that, as Matthews quoted earlier, extrinsic predications, quote, are true, at least in part, in virtue of something outside S to which S relationally stands, then the claim Tim is unaccompanied by zebras requires some distinct existing thing or things to which I relationally stand. And we can ask, what is that thing to which I stand in virtue of which it's true that I'm unaccompanied by zebras? And we should note it's not any particular zebra. You know, all existing zebras could keep their current relational status to me, and God could pop a dozen more zebras into this office just by, by creation. So it's not anything about zebras, it turns out, any existing zebras, in virtue of which it's true that Tim is unaccompanied by zebras. So it's going to be something pretty exotic that makes it true that I'm unaccompanied by zebras. I mean, more exotic than a Minnesotan zebra is exotic. And that's a cost for the theory. Notice that our preferred view denies that there must be something outside of me to which I relationally stand for it to be true that I'm unaccompanied by zebras. That truth can be true based on whether or not I'm accompanied by zebras. And I'm not accompanied by zebras. So their view, unlike our view, has, I think, a fairly large ontological cost to it in requiring these things to exist, which make these denials of accompaniment true. Now, the third thing I said I wanted to say is, finally, they haven't given us a reason in their paper to accept their view or prefer it over the whether or not view. They haven't even discussed the whether or not view. And so if they end up spurning their own authorities and they demand extra ontological cost for it, they've still given us no reason why anyone else must follow suit with what they do. So this is one open view of the distinction between extrinsic and intrinsic that's classical theist is free to accept in order to deny the soundness of the predication interpretation of the aloneness argument.
I appreciate you walking us through that example. I think the zebra one is especially helpful, and it's more plausible that there's not some entity out there that accounts for the lack of zebras being an extrinsic predication. It's much more. It seems much more intuitive that it's just, well, like it's based on whether or not there are zebras there. It seems we don't have to posit an extra thing. That does seem like it would be exotic, as you say. So I will say this now: in some subsequent writings, Schmidt and Mullins have said that, or at least Schmidt in one of his things has said that they don't necessarily endorse this stronger view that you both are critiquing. But it seems to be in the article that you're pressing against premise 2 that from their argumentation, if you give up that stronger view of extrinsic predication, you both now have an avenue to say God's knowledge that he is alone counts as extrinsic. Am I following that dialectic? That you see, like their premise to their argument, I can pull it back up, does seem to rest on the stronger view that they present in that paper, even if they say later on, you know what, you guys are right, this stronger view isn't that great.
No, I think you're right. I haven't kept up on what they've said about it online much, so I don't know what they've said about it. But given what you just said, it sounds to me like if you back off the strong view, you back off any reason for accepting premise 2, as you're pointing out, because premise 2 tells you extrinsicality, either fully extrinsic or partially extrinsic, requires some additional thing. And as Matthews quoted earlier, they have a quotation which tells you there has to be something external to the being in question. So I don't know, but if you back off the strong view, you no longer have support for premise 2. So if they didn't mean the feature interpretation, which you said earlier, and you back off this strong interpretation of extrinsicality, you don't get premise 2 either. It's not a good position in my estimation.
Okay, so I think we've spent most of the time so far, that was a helpful response in showing of your defense of why this argument doesn't go through, or your pointers as to why this aloneness argument fails. But you do have a lot more to say in the paper that I think is interesting. So I'm going to transition us to part 3 in our outline, where you both do offer a positive case. Because, okay, you classical theists, maybe you can say that this argument, evades the conclusion, but you still haven't really told us how you're going to fully cash out this knowledge that God is alone. How could the simple God know that he is alone without having any accidents? We haven't really done any explaining of that. And so you do have a whole section in your paper where you suggest how this might be done. So Dr. Grant, I'm going to go to you first. People are going to want some more information here. So can maybe you give us some highlights? How do you sketch out this positive account? How might it work that the absolutely simple God could know that he is alone?
Yeah. How could God know that he is alone without having an accident? Well, let me mention a few assumptions that are, I think, widely shared by theists, from which it simply follows that God would know that he is alone. Okay, and then I'll explain why these assumptions don't require that God have an accident. Okay? I think if you can do that, right, if it follows from commonly accepted theistic assumptions that God would know that he's alone, and then it turns out those assumptions don't require that God have an accident, I think you've done the job really of making a case that a simple God could know that he's alone in an alone world. All right, so what are those assumptions? Well, if you assume that necessarily God knows the full extent of his activity, then it follows that in the alone world, God knows that he is not creating anything. And if you assume that God knows all necessary truths, and if you assume that it's a necessary truth that nothing besides God can exist unless God creates it, then it follows that God knows that nothing can exist unless he creates something. So where do those assumptions leave us? In the alone world, God knows that nothing can exist unless he creates something, and he knows that he's not creating anything. And I think it follows from that in the alone world, God knows that he's alone, that nothing besides him exists. So that seems to just follow from common claims that theists would make, that he would know that he's alone. Now, does any of that require that God have an accident? We don't think so. On our proposal, what the full extent of God's activity consists in will differ across the alone world on the one hand, and worlds where God is not alone on the other. So in the alone world where there's just God, the full extent of God's activity consists entirely in the divine substance. And that divine substance does not include God's creating anything. God would know the full extent of the activity that he consists in the alone world. He would know that it included, for example, God's knowing and loving himself. And he would know that it did not include creating anything, even though he would know that it did include that he has the power to create. Now, no contingent state or accident seems to be required in this picture. And if so, if that's right, then God could know that he is alone in the alone world without having any accidents. Now, in non-alone worlds, the full extent of God's activity does not consist entirely in the divine substance. Rather, in worlds where God is not alone, there are other things. God's bringing about contingent objects and knowing that he's bringing them about consists in relations to items extrinsic to God, as defenders of divine simplicity have proposed. And this activity of creating and knowing these contingent objects does not involve any accidents in God either. So we have an account here on which God could know the contingent truth that he is alone in the alone world without there being any accidents in God, and where God could know contingent truths about created objects in non-alone worlds without there being any accidents in God either. And so we can account for God's knowledge really in non-alone worlds, but in the alone world, that he's alone without any accidents.
No, I think that's a helpful account, and I do want to raise some objections to it, and we're going to get to that shortly. But I think you sketched it out well there with very plausible premises that classical theists are going to hold. But Dr. Pawl, given that account that Dr. Grant just laid out, does that jive with the whether or not account of extrinsicality mentioned earlier? In other words, is God's knowledge that he is alone intrinsic or extrinsic based on the positive account that's just been sketched? I kind of just want you to walk us through that, fill in the details, and show, yes, it meets those conditions.
Sure. Yeah, happy to do so. So allow us to distinguish again, similarly to how we distinguished with respect to the feature interpretation or the predicate interpretation earlier. We can distinguish the feature that is God's act of knowing, so the act by which God knows that he is alone, from the predication, quote, God knows that he is alone. Those are two distinct things. Is the act by which God knows intrinsic or extrinsic? That is the first one, intrinsic or extrinsic? And we can secondly ask, is the predication, quote, God knows that he is alone, intrinsic or extrinsic? Now, to answer those, God's act of knowing that he is alone is intrinsic. It is simply the divine substance itself. And of course, the divine substance itself is intrinsic to God. The predication, quote, God knows that he is alone, that predication is extrinsic, since it depends on whether or not something else exists, and whether or not God stands in a causing relation to something. So I think it fits just fine. The whether or not account of extrinsicality fits just fine with the distinctions we're drawing here.
All right. Thank you for walking us through that. So we're going to turn now to perhaps the most exciting part, which is the objections, because even though I think you've made a great case so far, I've sketched out here 4 objections, some from their paper, some that go a little bit beyond it or just were based on some of my own thinking about this. And we're going to go 2 and 2, 2 to Dr. Grant, 2 to Dr. Pawl. But if either of you wants to chime in or follow up on something, feel free to just raise your hand or just to start talking and make a point. Who am I to tell these professors to raise their hand? This is in class. I should be raising my hand with these. No. This is great stuff. So first one to Dr. Grant. And actually, this does relate, and I'll link it to the show notes page, to an issue you did talk about a little bit the first time you were on Pat Flynn's podcast, because I listened to that one with great interest, and it was really interesting. You were talking about this topic, but here's the worry. In footnote number 15 in the paper, you raise the worry that your account for how a simple God is alone may require possibly rejecting content essentialism. After all, so why is that even a worry? Well, it seems the same, to go with what Dr. Pawl just said, it seems the same act by which God knows he is alone in the alone world would not be an act by which God knows he is alone in a non-alone world. That same one intrinsic action seems to be the act by which he knows he's alone in the alone world, but not an act by which he knows he's alone in a non-alone world, since he wouldn't be alone. So can you let us know first, maybe disentangling this, what is content essentialism? And does this worry require that we relinquish content essentialism?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And it may, in the end, depend on how content essentialism is defined. In an article published about 10 years ago, I defined content essentialism as the claim that beliefs and states or acts of knowing have their content essentially. And I indicated at the time that I found the claim hard to give up. So I was offering some solutions in a paper that were attempts to be solutions that didn't involve giving up content essentialism as just defined. So the way I just defined content essentialism, it implies that no belief or act of knowing with a content P, just let P stand for any content, could be identical to a belief or act of knowing without content P. Now, on that definition, it appears that our positive proposal for how a simple God knows that he is alone in a lone world violates content essentialism, at least defined that way. Why is that? Well, insofar as on our proposal, the act by which God knows that he is alone in a lone world, that's just the divine substance, right? But in non-alone worlds, that same act, the divine substance, does not have the content that God is alone, right? It's not true in those non-alone worlds that God is alone. Okay. So given the definition that I had given previously, I think our positive proposal would run up against that, would violate content essentialism so defined. Now, some philosophers reject content essentialism independently of theological concerns, and that's something I just need to think further about the issue. In more recent work, I talk not about content essentialism, but about object essentialism, the idea that acts have their objects essentially. But primarily what has concerned me in these more recent discussions is the proposal that God's activity in and of itself, might be exactly the same across worlds in which the objects of his activity differ. Okay? Or put differently, I have wanted to avoid the conclusion, if I could, that the objects of God's activity could be different than they are without any difference in God's activity itself. And one thing I want to say here is that it should be clear that our positive proposal for how a simple God could know that he is alone does not lead to this conclusion that God's activity differs in no way across worlds in which the objects of that activity differ. Why is that? Well, on our positive proposal, God's activity is not the same in the alone world and in non-alone worlds. In the alone world, God's activity consists entirely in the divine substance. That God's activity is entirely exhausted, as it were, by the divine substance in the alone world. But in non-alone worlds, God's activity consists not just in the divine substance, but in relations to things extrinsic to God. So our proposal does not commit us to the result that I've wanted to avoid more recently. And I'm more worried about that result than I am about violating content essentialism, at least as I defined it there in earlier work.
I think that's helpful. Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Pawl. You want to chime in on that?
I'm happy to talk to it. I'd like to. If you have something to say directly in response to what he just said, though, you should probably go first.
I was just going to say briefly that I found this way of talking to be helpful that Dr. Grant had just raised about considering a phrase you used a couple of times, either full activity or total activity. Because what I was going to say is if you take the alone world and God's intrinsic act, and then you take a world in which he creates, you can talk about God's activity in the alone world, which is fully exhausted by his extrinsic activity. But in the world where he creates, his total activity is his intrinsic activity plus these relations to other things. So if we want to make a qualify, at least how I'm seeing it is, if you want to qualify content essentialism to have this notion of total activity involved, then it's not necessarily the same act by which he knows that he is alone. That's not necessarily the same act by which he knows it's extrinsic. Well, the act by which he knows is the same. But if we talk about the total activity in a world where he creates, that's not held constant between the non-alone world and the alone world. But maybe I'm getting a little bit too far here. I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah, I think the positive proposal might, violate the definition of something that I gave in this earlier paper. But it may be that violating that definition is, not that big of a deal, really, right? I think, Dr. Pawl is going to go on to suggest some other ways to handle it. But it would seem a little strange to me to say that God's acting no differently, doing no differently in the alone world where he doesn't create than he is in our world where he creates all the stuff around us, right? And so that's the kind of thing that I've wanted to avoid, and I think our proposal avoids it.
Dr. Pawl, go ahead.
Yeah. I was thinking, here's one thing you might say. Maybe you could say this. It's concerning content essentialism. You might understand it as a thesis about types of accidental features. So, and all accidents, you might think, have their type and features essentially. A courage accident is necessarily such that anything that has it is courageous because of it, and not, say, square because of it. Similarly, for power accidents, the accident that a torch has, in virtue of which it lights things on fire, that accident is always of that type and always makes its possessor able to do that sort of activity. Similarly, for knowledge accidents, my accidental feature of knowing that 2 + 2 = 4 is necessarily such that it makes things know that, and it doesn't make things courageous, and it doesn't make them light things on fire, it doesn't make them square. So you get essentiality of type, I think, for accidental features. Now, I believe in powers, and I believe that God has power, but I don't think that in saying that God has power, I'm attributing to him, ontologically speaking, the same sort of thing I attribute to the torch. The torch has you might think of it as like a doodad, a accidental form, a something. It has a thing in virtue of which it lights stuff on fire, and God can light stuff on fire, but doesn't have to do it with a particular doodad, a particular accidental feature. Is it a problem that is that a problem for what we might call power essentialism, the claim that accidents have their power variety necessarily and their features necessarily? I don't see that it is. It would be if I were saying that God has those doodads, and sometimes they do one thing, and sometimes they do a different thing, make something courageous, but I'm not saying that. So to the question at hand, I think you can accept content essentialism as a thesis about accidents, accidental thoughts, accidental powers, accidental habits. Then you can say it doesn't apply to God owing to the fact that he lacks such things. So it says it's true, but it's vacuous with respect to God because God lacks the sort of features in question that content essentialism ranges over, namely accidental features. So I think it might be another way to get all that you initially might see as valuable in content essentialism, keep it, but rein it into accidental features.
No, that's a fantastic point. It makes sense with something that we say all the time on the Classical Theism podcast, that certain ways of dealing and knowing and doing and so on that we're acquainted with in the creaturely realm doesn't necessarily end up applying to God. So that thesis, content essentialism, may be pretty strong as it relates to accidental knowing and so forth. But as you point out, we might have to limit the scope of that thesis to creaturely knowers because of those reasons that you gave. So it's not just like an ad hoc thing, but because there's no doodads and so forth. That's why we would limit the scope. So I think that is a good point. These are interesting things to think more about. Did you want to say one more thing about that, Dr. Grant? Because I'm going to raise another objection next.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay.
With the next one. Yeah.
All right. So I'll start this one out with you, Dr. Pawl, and if you want to chime in, Dr. Grant, you can. But in one section of the paper, you both note, quote, God's bringing about contingent objects, and knowing that he is bringing them about might consist in relations to items extrinsic to God, as proponents of divine simplicity have proposed, end quote. And Dr. Grant brought up that same point earlier. I want to know, is that consistent with Aquinas' view that God does not stand in a real relation to creatures? Can the God who does not himself stand in a real relation to creation know things he is bringing about in the way that you suggest?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the answer is yes, and I'm going to tell you why. But to tell you why, I have to say a bit about the medieval view of relations. So it's one step back and two steps forward. Sometimes it sounds as if people intend to distinguish real relations from like phony or fictitious relations. Either God really, actually, honestly is related to something, or it's a fiction that we say he is, but he really isn't. But this can't be what the medievals meant. I mean, after all, they talk about mixed relations, and those are relations that are real in one direction and not real in their particular sense of it in the other direction. And how could it be that a relation is really, actually, honestly there one way, but a mere fiction the other way? So that can't be the way they're thinking of it. How should we understand it then? Well, let me say just a little bit more briefly about relations, and then I'll circle back, I promise, and I'll answer the question at hand. Now, we should think of it like this instead, I think. Consider some contingent relational claim. Here's one. Quote, Father Alvaro is praying for Henry, end quote. There's a subject of the relational claim, that's Father Alvaro. There's the other relatum to which Father Alvaro is related. We often call this the term, and that's Henry. Father Alvaro is praying for Henry. He's related to Henry as the term. And there's what they call foundation, the ontological difference maker, which accounts for why sometimes Father and Henry exist and the claim is false, and why other times it's true. And so you can ask, what's the difference? What's that foundation? And importantly here, where is it located? Who's got it? Well, sometimes a foundation is in both the subject and the term. So if I say that Henry is as tall as Father Alvaro, that's going to require each guy to have a specific accidental feature of height. And that's a mutual relation since the foundation is found in both. They each have their height feature. But sometimes, as with my initial example, the foundation is found in only one of the relata. And so in this case, of course, Father Alvaro has a certain mental feature. And because of that, the relational statement, quote, Father Alvaro is praying for Henry, is true. The foundation is found in the subject. And so Father Alvaro is praying for Henry is a real relation in the way they use that terminology. Consider the correlated truth, Henry is being prayed for by Father Alvaro. This too is really, honestly, actually true, but the foundation is not found in Henry. Henry could remain exactly the same way from T1 to T2, and yet the predication go from being false to being true only in virtue of something external to him changing how it is, only in virtue of Father Alvaro going from being one way to being another way. So in that case, the foundation is not found in the subject. It's not something about Henry in him, but the foundation exists. And so it's a true relation of reason. That's all they mean by real relation of reason. It's a question of where the ontological difference maker resides. Does it reside in the subject of the predication in question? Okay, with that brief summary in hand, go back to your original question. God doesn't stand in a real relation to creatures. Now, what's that mean? Well, for a while, there are true relational statements concerning God and creatures. None of them is true on account of God having some contingent foundation in him, in virtue of which they are true. No, all the foundational work is on, you might think, the other side of that relation. It's on the non-God side of the equation. But that no more stops God from knowing about his creation than the foundation being on the Father Alvaro side stops Henry from knowing that Father Alvaro is praying for him. So that's a long way of saying, yeah, it makes sense even with the distinction between real relations and relations of reason. And I think it's just in part because of a heavily metaphysically loaded way people sometimes understand that distinction, which I think isn't borne out by what the medievals are doing with it.
Oh, I appreciate that distinction as well. It's very easy to come across in our discourse like real means real as opposed to fake. Mm-hmm. Real relation as opposed to a fake relation. And then people jump right to, okay, well, does God really love you or does he just fake love you in a fictitious sense.
Right.
And
Right.
so I think that, but we have to think, no, we're not talking about real versus fictitious. We're talking about this metaphysical view of relations, which asks the question, where does the ontological foundation reside when we're talking about that relation? So I appreciate you sketching that out. Dr. Grant, did you have anything to add on that point? Because I got another objection to hit you with, if not.
Yeah, I mean, no, I think that covers it. Covers it well.
Okay. All right. So here's the next one for you. And the two more, I promise. We've been doing a lot of technical work in metaphysics. You guys are doing a great job. I really appreciate it. Only the most really excited and tenacious viewers and listeners are still on here for this technical discussion. But I have to warn you, we have a lot of those on the Classical Theism podcast. People, they come here for this stuff. They're hungry for it. So don't, you might go to other venues and they're like, man, medieval views of relations. Who wants to talk about that? Well, here at the Classical Theism podcast, I'm telling you, that's what they want to hear. That's what they want to hear. But here's the objection to Dr. Grant. Is your positive account vulnerable to what Schmid and Mullins say in their original paper about postponing the location of an intrinsic contingency? Let's take it that the act by which God knows he is alone is necessary, even though the content of what God knows, i.e., that he is alone, is contingent. So that's that distinction that Dr. Pawl made a few moments ago. The act by which he knows he is alone is necessary. The content that he is alone is contingent. But then the objector can ask about the locus of the content of this contingent knowledge. Where does it reside? After all, in the alone world, there's nothing outside of God. And if it's admitted to be inside of God, well, then we've just relocated the problem of intrinsic contingency. So how would you respond to that objection?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting objection. We're inclined to say that the objection mistakenly reifies mental content. So it treats content as if it were a thing that has to be located somewhere. It's got to be located somewhere, and therefore it's got to either be inside God or out. But we want to reject such reification. And we think there's reason to think that classical proponents of divine simplicity, such as St. Thomas, would as well. So Aquinas, for example, thinks that God knows all the many, perhaps infinitely many ways in which the divine essence could be participated in by creatures. These are sometimes known as the divine ideas. So there are many, many contents of God's knowledge that he knows in knowing his own essence. But Aquinas doesn't think this violates divine simplicity, for the reason that he doesn't think that these contents of divine knowing are entities or things, or that they're anything that would have to enter into composition with the divine substance in violation of divine simplicity. So we think that the objection, it turns on assuming that content is some sort of entity, some sort of thing that has to be located inside or outside God, and we want to reject that initial reification.
And yet it's still acceptable to say the content is contingent, because when we say the content is contingent, we mean it didn't have to be, it could have been, and it didn't have to be. The truth that it's true. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. The truth is still, yeah, it's a contingent truth, right? I mean, the worry is, okay, we of course grant that the content, what we mean by the content is that the truth known, right? That God is alone. So we certainly want to grant that that's a contingent truth, right? What we deny is that it's some sort of contingent thing that has to have this location that's either, outside God, in which case, that contradicts the supposition that God is alone, or inside God, in which case it looks like it's another entity distinct from the divine substance that would have to enter into composition with the divine substance in some way. So we acknowledge, of course, the contingency of the content, but we deny the thinginess of content, and if in doing so, we don't think that it's got to be located either inside, outside God, like it would if it were a thing.
Okay, I appreciate that clarification. No, that is helpful. Last objection here. This is the last one of the four. I'm going to start with Dr. Pawl here. This one is about, this last objection is to asking us to consider about other potentially contingent truths God knows in the alone world that aren't as obviously explained by the account you gave earlier about God's lack of relations to other things, like the whether or not view. So consider in the alone world, let's think about some other things, not just that God knows that he is alone, not just that proposition, but some other stuff. We might call the proposition F, God freely chooses to refrain from creating. God freely chooses to refrain from creating. This contingent truth, in other words, F, is about God's free choice and not the mere fact that he's alone. So it seems to involve a little bit more than lack of relations to other things. So how can you explain God's knowledge of this contingent truth in an alone world?
Yep, thank you. The answer here is somewhat similar to the one that Matthews just gave us. In the alone world, God does not, and he need not, make a choice understood as a particular contingent act, either identical to or distinct from the divine substance, a choice to refrain from creating. Consider the ramifications of such a contingent choice. It can't be identical to the divine substance, since it by stipulation is contingent, and the divine substance isn't contingent. But also it can't be distinct from the divine substance, since were it distinct, it would be a thing, and a thing that exists alongside God in an alone world. There can't be such a thing, though. So such a contingent choice in the alone world can be neither identical nor distinct from the divine substance, but anything at all were to exist would be either identical or distinct from the divine substance. And so such a contingent act of choosing does not exist in the alone world. Some of these arguments against the alone world, and I have to say, I like them. I think they're good. I'm happy that Schmidt and Mullins wrote this paper. I think it's a good paper. I'm glad that we had time to respond to it and that we did. I hope the conversation continues, but I'm not saying they do this, but there's a little buzzer in my mind anyway. There's a buzzer. And if I tell you something exists that's not God in the alone world, you should just hit that buzzer immediately. And sometimes you might try to get me to say it so you can hit the buzzer too. Like, how about this contingent choice God makes? What should we say about that? And then you're just waiting for it, right? You're waiting for me to say there is one. And then, you contradicted yourself. Or how about this, the contents and their contingency? What about those? And I just, in my mind's eye, I picture you with a button, just ready to get me. So you're not going to get me. Anyway, so that's an answer to that question.
No, and I think that's helpful. And I think it's consistent with what Dr. Grant has explained on the show before and on other episodes with his extrinsic model. We interpret, God's willing and choosing and intentionally acting. We can interpret all of those predications when we talk about things not in the alone world, but just in the world where he does create. We can interpret those things like the choosing, the willing, and the intending. We can talk about those as referring to the effects coming into existence with a dependence relation on God. And if we talk about his choice or his intentional action, we could add that that's under the ratio of him doing it for a purpose, for a reason, and so forth. And there's all those kinds of discussions as well. And that's consistent. But this has been a really helpful discussion to me. You know what? Here, I'm sorry. I got to ask one more thing real quick. Back to the content essentialism thing, because you both kind of prompted my mind here. If we take Dr. Grant's point that content essentialism is about beliefs or states of knowing that have their content essentially, I'm detecting two different paths we might go with this. What Dr. Pawl is saying is we might restrict the scope and say that content essentialism is a thesis about creatures or about accidental knowing or knowing involving accidents and so on. But there's another part of me that also thinks I could say, well, yes, or if we want to broaden it out to say that God is covered under this umbrella, I could say that he satisfies content essentialism in an analogous way. And the analogous way is I just have to take his belief or state of knowing to be the total activity of intrinsic plus extrinsic activity. And that total activity is not held constant in the alone world versus the world that he creates. So it wouldn't violate now this is not, I mean, it's kind of strange. I mean, we don't necessarily have to do this. I think what Dr. Pawl is saying is right. But if we wanted to go that route, that might be a second path. Dr. Grant, I'm just curious if you think I'm going off the rails, if you're leaning one direction or the other on this, or if you want to think more about it, that's fine too.
So I think either the way you just off the top, okay, I think either the way that you've just kind of redefined or characterized content essentialism and the way that Tim does it, I think that they would both avoid our proposals, violating content essentialism, right? So these are very likely just very minor tweaks in a way that would have very little impact on, the reasons those who would embrace content essentialism would want to embrace it in the first place, right? But would avoid any violation of our proposal of content essentialism so defined, okay? So I think the way I had defined it in that earlier paper, probably our proposal, maybe strictly does violate it, but that I may have not defined it well. And then, as I say, there are people who have reasons for wanting to reject content essentialism, and I need to think more about that. I mean, some people who I know who I don't think are crazy, have wanted to reject it. So I should look at that a little bit more myself as well. But I did find an intuitive appeal to some of this, and certainly to this, to this thought that, God is doing something differently in a world where He creates and knows John DeRosa than He does in the alone world, where He doesn't create and know you. It seems to me that God, just natural to think that God is doing something differently in these worlds. I'd like to be able to preserve that natural way of speaking, and I think our proposal does that. So.
All right, very good. So we're going to bring this to a close here. I really appreciate the work that both of you have done on this paper, but I'm just going to ask this closing question. What's one of your key takeaways from this research, and what is it important, maybe a summary idea or two, important for us as classical theists? This is the Classical Theism podcast. What is it important for us to keep in mind when discussing these sorts of issues? So, Dr. Pawl, we'll go to you first.
Sure, yeah. So I think there's important work to be done on two fronts. And this is something that was really solidified in my mind when working on this project with Matthews. And it's important to keep them distinct insofar as you're able to. So one front is presenting the inner harmony and the logic of classical theism. So these thinkers weren't just crawling out on every available limb, just rejecting relations and doing whatnot. They had reasons. And when you see it all put together, you think, oh, that's a pretty nice belief set. You don't have to believe it, but you can at least say, it's carefully crafted, put together, logically honed, beautiful in its own way. And it's one good thing to be able to present classical theism internally, consistently, beautifully like that. A second good thing, though, is just logical, careful analysis of objections. Does this follow from that? Is the opponent's argument valid? Is it sound? Does it beg the question? Is there equivocation? And so on and so forth. That's a different thing. Now, sometimes those two come together, but often they can be separated. And I think we do this in this paper fairly well. Not to toot our horn, we at least separate them. You can judge for yourself whether we do it well or poorly. But we begin with an assessment of the logic of the argument, whether premises 2 and 5 are true, and so on. And I think that you can do without getting pretty deep into Thomistic weeds. But then we go on and we say, how might a positive account look, or how might a classical theist want to approach this? And here, a lot of that was the work of Dr. Grant, and I think quite well done, where it's presenting in an inner harmony the views. And I think if you find yourself up against a carefully crafted, valid argument of an opponent, rarely do you have to take the running start that you see sometimes, where you back up all the way to being is divided between potency and act. And if you read Aquinas' sentence commentary, you see he divides these things 4 ways. But if you read over here, you see actus essendus is meant in these 6 ways. And your opponent's eyes glaze over. The interlocutor gets lost, and you don't need all that stuff. And I think, our eyes would glaze over too. If you're arguing with a process theologian and you give a carefully crafted, valid argument against the view. And the response you get is, well, we should consider how his views changed from before he moved to the States to after he moved to the States. And here are some early works that he wrote, and notice these two distinctions, and your eyes would glaze over too. You want to interrupt and say, but wait, what about the actual argument I gave? I gave you 8 lines numbered on a piece of paper. The last line said modus tollens and cited 2 previous lines. Like, what happened to this argument? And I think, though we might not believe it, we classical theists, even our long-winded, statements of prolonged oration get boring to other people, even when they're about classical theism, even about Thomas Aquinas. I promise you it's true. You might not believe it, but people tire of it. So the general thing I brought from this was this: start with the logic and try just to show on the argument's own terms without getting the whole Thomistic apparatus out of the shed. Start with just the argument's own terms and try to see if you can show a fault with it. And bring in the Thomism, which is beautiful and harmonious and good in all ways. Bring in the Thomism only as necessary as a means by which to respond to the argument actually given by your interlocutor. That's what I thought.
I really appreciate that. I think that's some really helpful advice. Great closing comments. Dr. Grant, anything else on your mind by way of closing remarks?
Well, a couple of things. One sort of piggybacks on what Dr. Pawl was saying, but I mean, you may not always need to have the whole Thomistic apparatus move that forward first, but I think knowing that can help you identify where arguments go wrong, where there are mistaken assumptions that you are able to identify because you have this deep, rich set of distinctions, right, in the background. So you don't always have to bring all that out forward, but knowing it can be very helpful, and then you can deploy it strategically. I guess the other thing I was thinking is, I was just struck by working on this paper, like how, I mean, something we know, but how just phrases like God's knowledge can be ambiguous. I mean, you have to be really careful in philosophy and theology. And it's easy to trip up. I mean, like it's easy to trip up even in thinking about. I mean, you might think that the aloneness argument trips up on these points in various ways, but it's easy even in my own thinking about this to trip up on some of these points and get confused in my own head, and then have to unravel all of that. So it's philosophy's hard.
Honestly, I thought it was such a clear paper. That's why I really thought it would be worthwhile to do a show on this and help us with these distinctions. And I think both of your encouragement towards the end is right. I know just one quick example to go along with what Dr. Pawl and Dr. Grant, what you're both saying, that I found is in a lot of discussions where people will just raise, who they've heard about classical theism or divine simplicity, they just raise an issue about, well, hey, wait a minute, how does divine simplicity work with the Trinity? And I've seen people, in a quick conversation, you could start to trot out the psychological analogy and questions 27 to 43 and how all the intra-Trinitarian processions work and missions and distinctions and this and that. And you're right, the person's eyes just glaze over. Whereas I think a shorter and quicker brief reply is just, well, actually, let's just clarify. Divine simplicity denies all distinctions that would entail composition. And Trinitarian classical theists, we believe that there are certain distinctions, the Trinitarian relations, that don't entail composition. And that could be like a short reply. And then later on, if you can get into all that other stuff in a more rich way. So at least that's just one example of where you've brought that up that I've seen happen. So I wanted to mention that. But we'll close with this. Dr. Tim Pawl, Dr. Matthews Grant, it's been awesome having you on the Classical Theism podcast. Thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise. But let the listeners know, where can they go to find out more about your work? And then we'll say goodbye.
Yeah, so I have a website. It's timpawl@wordpress.com. I have a Phil Papers profile, which has a lot of my published work listed there. You can go look at that too. Thanks.
Yeah, I need to come up with some online, place to send people. I don't really have that yet. But I guess maybe if you can get a hold of my book, I mean, a lot of there's a lot in there that I think is fairly representative of of what I've done, and there are also references in there to other things. So.
Well, what I'll do is on the show notes page, I'm going to link to both of your books as well as previous podcast appearances you've done here and some other video appearances. So people can follow up on that to get all the information. But thanks again for joining me today. It's been a blast.
Happy to
Thank
be
you.
here.